All right, we are live for this special solo episode of the Creative Imposter Live. And this is part of our When Your Art Becomes Your Job series that we are resuming here after a short break. And I'm going to put this URL up on the screen. This is bit.ly/art versus job. That's bit.ly/art vs job. And this is where you can find the YouTube playlist of all of the conversations that we've had so far on this series, as well as some upcoming conversations on this topic. And this conversation is a little bit of a left turn, a right turn, whatever you want to call it. But I am your host, Andrea Klunder. I am a podcast and content strategist, also a media producer, storyteller, educator, creative director, founder. I don't know how many more titles you want me to put after my name, but I'm telling you all of these things in case this is our first time connecting, in case this is our first time having this communication together. But I'm telling you these things because it's relevant to today's topic. And today's topic is, are you tired of talking about AI? Me too. But can we talk about it? Because I feel like I am just now starting to hear the conversations that are relevant to me that I want to be having around this topic. So I think that there are also, and I think that there are also a lot of creators and entrepreneurs and small business owners and artists and educators who are trying to figure out where we fit in to this AI hype bubble that is happening right now. Is it hype? Is it a bubble? I don't know. I am going to say yes, it is. I feel off the top that I was very resistant to all of the AI stuff in the beginning, not all of it, but when it started really being pushed upon us with software. So I work in podcasting. It's a digital medium. I use a lot of software. My biggest expense other than my contractors is my tech stack and all of the software as a service that I use in order to produce my own podcasts, in order to help my clients produce their podcasts. And a lot of the software and tools that I use every day in podcasting are now integrating AI in ways that is either difficult or impossible to opt out of. And the great thing about that is that even if I don't want the AI tools or can't make use of them, the prices of everything is going up and like, oh, look at, we have this great new AI integration, and your subscription amount is going up. And I'm like, I don't even want it. I just want you to do what you did before. So I think that there are some ways in which we're having to reconcile with something that maybe we didn't choose. And you know what? I'm not here to be prescriptive about whether or how you should or should not be integrating AI into your own personal life, your own business life, your own creative life, your workflow. That's not the intention of this episode. So if that's what you're looking for, you're not going to find it here. I'll just let you know that. But I wanted to let you in on my process of how I've been thinking about these things. And I'll also disclose to you right off the top that I don't fully have my full AI policy written out yet. I am still working on creating that. And that was part of what I wanted to have this conversation here for, because if you are watching this in real time, or if you are watching the replay, or if you are listening to the audio later, I am very curious to hear what your thought processes have been, because I learn very much by observation and example. And I have a few examples of creators and thought leaders that I am going to share with you in this episode that have been really helpful for sort of looking at the contents of the bottle from outside the bottle, or the contents or the label, reading the label. Yeah, reading the label on the bottle from outside the bottle. So people who are more similar to me in terms of scope and what we do in our creative work, and looking at what choices they've made, what things they've considered. And I want to also acknowledge upfront that your decisions about AI, your beliefs, your policies are probably going to change. They might change frequently. And I think this is one of the things that is actually tripping me up in publicly publishing an AI policy and creating a disclosure for my clients, is that I feel like every time I think I have it pinned down, something changes, or my understanding of a thing changes. And that's part of what this thing is. This whole world is being thrown at us without adequate time for us to fully understand the internal mechanisms of how everything is working and what the implications are. And now I want to tell you a little story, which is what got the whole ball rolling on this topic for me. And the story is that several months ago, I was working on a client's podcast, and I wrote some content for them that I don't normally write. That's not normally my job, but just the way things worked out, I ended up having to write it. And I had a very limited amount of time, and I wrote it myself. So it was not generated by AI. I did use AI to summarize the podcast episode for me because it had been a while since I had listened to it. And then I wrote the summary based on what I remembered by triggering my memory from the AI ChatGPT specifically. But the writing was mine. It was not copy pasted. It was not even started by the ChatGPT. That was just a summary to refresh my memory. However, the client perceived that it had been written by AI. So I don't know what that says about my writing, that people are confusing my writing for AI. Maybe it's the fact that I wrote it quickly. Maybe it's the fact that I have been using ChatGPT for clients in order to help with SEO and AEO, so search engine optimization and answer engine optimization. I am aware of the fact that in today's online ecosystem, it's not the problem for my clients is not that there are too many podcasts for them to compete with. The problem for discoverability is that there are so many mechanisms in place working behind the scenes in all of this algorithmically driven online space that it is more and more challenging to get your content to surface, especially when you're a smaller entity or a more independent creator, to get your content to surface when people are searching. Now, that used to just be like a Google search, but now we have not just Google searches, but we have algorithmic searches in social media on the different platforms. We also have the answer engines. So some people are still searching in Google. And when they do that, there's two sets of results, right? There's the AI result at the top, and some people are clicking that. Some people are not clicking that and are still looking at the ranked search results. But some people are foregoing that altogether and specifically using Claude or ChatGPT or Perplexity or Gemini or whatever it is to ask questions rather than doing a traditional Google search. And I actually accidentally have come up twice that I know of in answer in large language model searches for prospective clients, which, when they filled out the form on my website to book a consultation with me, and I ask, who can I thank for the referral, or how did you hear about us? The Creative Imposter Studios, which is my very small boutique podcast strategy and production agency. And they said, ChatGPT. I was like, wow, okay, what on earth did I do to get ChatGPT to recommend me as opposed to any of the other podcast strategists or production agencies or editors or whoever that exist out there? And so I talk to those prospects about specifically if they remembered what it was they were looking for, what questions, queries they were putting. And there were some very specific things that are what triggered me to stand out from even larger entities than me. And there's an opportunity there for the smaller clients and the more indie creators to leverage in a clever way that answer engine optimization. However, I, in my brain, don't know how to do that because I don't know what the chatbots are surfacing or how they're finding things, but I can ask the chatbots how to help them find my clients' content and put it to the right people. I can help with that, what we call domain expertise, by using those tools. So I have been using ChatGPT for that. And maybe my brain is just so used to reading those outputs for that search engine and answer engine optimization for the large language models. Like I'm literally prompting, please give me episode titles and headings that will help the large language models do this and be interesting for a human. Like we're trying to find that balance between generating titles and tags and descriptions that serve the bots versus serve the humans, because we need the bots to send it to the humans. Otherwise, the humans aren't going to get it, right? So in order for the human to find it, the bot needs to find it first and decide that it's the thing the human wants. And that's the way I've been kind of thinking about it. So going back to my story, the client thought that I had used AI to write a thing and was understandably upset, and clarified that they did not want us using AI to generate any content for their show. And I started to get nervous because, as I mentioned before, a lot of the software that we use is using AI in their processes, whether I like it or not. Now, is there a different software that I could use? Maybe, and maybe not in some cases. And so this led me to some questions about what my responsibility as an agency owner, as a service provider, are to my clients. And I had a conversation with a lawyer who specializes in intellectual property, specifically podcasting, and that's Gordon Firemark. And Gordon said, and I don't want to quote him directly here. You can definitely reach out to him if you want to know more. But my takeaway from my conversation with Gordon about this is that, yes, absolutely, as a digital service provider, I need to have an AI policy in place that is publicly available. And I need to have a more specific disclosure that my clients sign off on and agree to. And so this goes to one of my points for this conversation, which is consent when using AI tools and processes. And so then I started freaking out. I was like, oh God, I need a disclosure, blah, 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 blah. And that is what sent me on this whole path. Indeed, I myself am concerned about a lot of things. If you want to go to the extreme, gut level existential crisis kind of concerns, one of my favorite podcasts is Vibe Check, and with Zach Stafford and Saeed Jones. Saeed Jones is a poet and educator, and they were talking about AI, and they were talking about on one of their episodes, they were talking about people who are outsourcing like everything to the AI, like their scheduling and medical opinions and email and text responses to people and dating advice and creative output and even their thinking in a way. And Saeed said that a phrase that has been rattling around my brain, which is that when you do that, you're evacuating yourself from your own life. I cannot think of a more dramatic phrase. And it just like hit me in the gut, evacuating yourself from your own life. Now, using a chat tool, a large language model like ChatGPT, in order to get some keywords to put into a podcast episode description to help the bots find it, to help surface it to humans, I wouldn't consider that, but there are extremes that we can fall into, and it's like a slippery slope, right? You use it for this, and then you use it for this, and then you use it more, and then you're like, oh, this is easy. Oh, this makes my life better. Oh, I don't have to think about this. And in fact, I brought this up with my classmates in the graduate certificate program that I'm taking at Texas A&M with Melina Palmer about behavioral economics. And in the class that I'm taking right now, I had brought up some of these different responses to AI that some of my clients are having. So, for example, there's the one extreme that says, I don't want you using AI for any of our podcast work, to clients who are curious. Two, I have a client who actually has started consulting and training on how to use AI as a specialty in his specific industry and niche. So it's like from one end to the other in terms of my client scope, in terms of their AI adoption and optimism or pessimism. And I tend to sit right in the middle of this, like I do a lot of things. Like I'm either a cautious optimist or I'm a hopeful pessimist, is how I described it to my classmates. I think that's pretty accurate depending on how you look at it on a lot of things, but on the AI as well. And my client who's all in, who's on consulting and coaching, he was showing me some examples of things that I could be doing in my business that, using a tool specifically like Claude to generate, I could potentially come to the same outcome or the same output that I would typically create, let's say, when auditing a client's podcast for strategy. Maybe that audit would typically take me half a day or more, sometimes 2 full days, depending on how in depth the audit is. And he was showing me how I could shortcut that time and arrive at the same strategy, the same observations in a couple of hours. And I was worrying that because of something that we call the effort heuristic, like we as humans tend to think that the more effort you put into something or the more time you spend on something, the higher value it is. But so I started worrying that if I'm only putting a few hours into something that used to take me 2 days to do, is the value lower? And therefore, if the value is lower, do I have to charge less for it? And his argument was that if the output is the same and I arrive at the same strategic recommendations, what does it matter how much time I put into it? The value of the strategy is the value of the strategy. And so that's what I was kind of asking my behavioral economics classmates and colleagues about. And it's true that there's always those that look at it like, well, of course you would make your life more efficient. Of course you would use this. Of course, this would put you ahead of many other podcast strategists if you're utilizing this to become more efficient and still provide the same value to them. You can now use that time to add even more value or do something that you wouldn't otherwise have time to do, or they can invest their money into and resources into even more services that are going to get them further. And so that was one way of thinking about it. And uh I forgot why I went down that tangent, but it's just interesting to see like the different reactions that people are having and kind of figuring out how to use all of that input, all of that data that we're collecting, all of people's feelings and responses, and all of the information that we're learning to set what feels like a reasonable policy around AI. When I say policy, what I mean is clearly setting boundaries and intentions and being aware that when you set this policy, it's going to change, right? Uh, I got some ideas from Amelia Ruby, who has a podcast called Off the Grid, and she did a whole series of interviews and solo episodes on AI somewhat recently this spring. Particularly, there's an episode called How to Write a Thoughtful AI Policy. So, again, this is on Off the Grid podcast. You can find it. And she broke down her process of thinking into three categories: what you, as the creator or the service provider or the business owner, will or won't use AI for; collaborations and service providers. So when you are looking to hire somebody or partner with somebody or work with somebody, what policies do they need to have in place for them to be a good fit to work with you or for you to hire them? And then three, what are your policies for clients, especially if you are generating content or learning resources for your clients or hosting communities, Zoom calls, training sessions, strategy sessions? What policies do you have in place for your clients? And that third category was something that I had not considered before listening to Amelia's episode. And specifically, she gave an example about an online community that she has, membership community, and people coming into the Zoom calls. And these are meant to be private calls. They don't get published publicly. And people are sharing their own business challenges and situations and things like that. And she made the decision to not allow AI agents to come into the Zoom calls, AI note takers, etc., either along with the participants or in place of the participants, because certainly it's hard to know. And this was a point that Gordon made too, legally, some of these terms of use and privacy policies that the software companies that we're using are posting publicly are a little bit opaque, and they change frequently. And you just click accept because if you were to read the whole thing, it probably wouldn't even make sense to you anyway. And you need to use the software to do whatever it is that you're trying to do in your business, right? So, certainly, the private information that is being shared in that call is somehow, uh, even if anonymously, in quotes, being sent back to the language model to train that language model on that data. And so it's not really private. So she made the decision not to allow that in her calls. And I was like, this is smart thinking. Also, having not only making disclosures to her clients, but having clients sign off on not taking her training materials, her internal proprietary training materials, and putting them into their own GPT agents for summary or generation ideas, because again, that's Amelia's IP and it's for the individual's use only. And not that they're trying to, like, I am working for OpenAI and I am training their model on Amelia's content, but that unwittingly, just by trying to put it in for your own usage, you are sharing that data with the tech company. So things to really like parse through and figure out where your lines in the sand are, and to be aware of where the lines in the sand of the people that you are working with, either as collaborators, partners, vendors, clients, etc., are working with. It's a lot of labor that is unpaid. I'll be very frank about that. So these were the three categories, and I appreciate that. Another good example of thinking through AI policies comes from Andrea Jones from the Mindful Marketing podcast. And her episode is My AI Rules Have Changed. Again, I like looking to thought leaders who are in similar spaces to me. So I do listen to a few tech podcasts. If you want to listen to techie people talk about the techie sides of things and wrestle with the philosophy of this and that, two that I really like are Tech Won't Save Us and Your Undivided Attention. Those are two that I think are really good. I also like Offline with John Favreau from Crooked Media, and that's a little bit more about policy. But I think that policy is really, we'll get into this a little bit more in a moment, but more so than individual usage, policy is really going to be more important than whether or not you use ChatGPT to do some SEO. Uh, I think that where I am landing on some of this creative decision making, some things that I know, is anything that is already publicly available. Podcast episode content, website content, all that stuff, anything that is already publicly available on the internet, I am going to go ahead and assume that these LL companies have already scraped that information or will be scraping that information and using it and adapting it into their own models. It is publicly available. I am publishing it out there. And so, therefore, I don't mind putting the transcript of a podcast episode into ChatGPT in order to get some SEO or title recommendations or Instagram caption suggestions for that, because it's going to be out there publicly anyway. Anything that is internal. So if I'm working with a client and we're talking through internal strategy, that is not something that they're publicly posting on their website or publicly posting on their podcast, that is something I will not be putting into ChatGPT. If I need to use an AI tool to help me with something strategically there, it's going to be anonymized and not have specifics in it and not be tied back directly to that client, because that is their proprietary internal information. So that is not going to be going. I've also changed my stance on, I was using the AI note taker in Zoom because I am terrible at follow-ups and terrible at taking notes. And I'm not doing that anymore either because I just don't trust it for internal conversations. So if it's already public information, fine. If it's internal strategic information, no. I will not be using LLMs or AI to generate fresh content. So never will it be writing a podcast script for me. Never will it be, never will I be outsourcing my creative thought process to ChatGPT. There was a colleague in my behavioral economics program who posted an article, and now I forgot here where that article is, but it was an article about the two types of thinking that we tend to study in behavioral economics, which are system 1 and system 2. And this relates to the difference between logical, well-reasoned, thoughtful, in-depth thought processes, which is the minority of our thinking. We think we do that a lot, but we really don't. And the intuitive style thinking that happens based on past experience, based on pattern recognition, based on heuristics or shortcuts to the way that our brain works. And that's how we do a lot of our thinking. So normally we talk about those two systems of thinking. But this introduced the concept of a third type of thinking where people are now outsourcing both of those ways of thinking to AI and how that influences the decisions that we come to and the choices that we make. Terrifying article. If I can find the source, I will definitely link it in the show notes for the audio version of this episode. But I will not be outsourcing any of my creative thinking, nor will I be using AI to create a voice agent of myself. If you want to hear more about voice agents or agentic AI, there is a podcast series that I adore in the way that mm, in the way that I sometimes watch horror movies that I know are not good for my nervous system, and I can't look away from them and I get sucked in. That's how I feel about this podcast. Not good for my nervous system. It is horrible. I hate it and I cannot stop listening to it. It is called Shell Game. And this is by journalist Evan Ratliff. Season 1 is all about him experimenting with creating an AI voice clone of himself. And then season 2 is all about him creating a completely AI run company, software company, using all AI agents with different personalities. Both seasons are fascinating and terrifying, in my opinion, but it's very well done. So that's Shell Game with Evan Ratliff. And those are things that I have put my line in the sand. Anything that I do use ChatGPT for, or I'm going to be experimenting with Claude on a few things, nothing gets published out out of the box. Everything has to be reviewed by the strategist. That's me. It needs to go through a human. It needs to be pressure tested because my job as the service provider is to hold the brand for my client. I need to be sure that I am holding the vision and the voice of my client, that it sounds authentic, that there's nothing inaccurate in any of that content. I one time put in a podcast transcript and asked it to give me quotes that supported certain topics. And it gave me these incredible quotes. And I was like, wow, these quotes are amazing. And it attributed them to people who were in the podcast. And I was like, these are amazing. I don't remember that person saying that in the episode, did they? And I checked, and ChatGPT had made up and attributed quotes, even with the transcript, that were never spoken. And when I said, I don't think these quotes came from the episode, nobody said this, it was like, oh, yeah, you're right. But these are quotes that they might have said that support those topics. And I'm like, you can't quote a thing that was never said. But if I had just copied and pasted, or if I had not actually listened to that episode, then I could have been totally misquoting somebody. Which brings me to another funny story that one of my colleagues told of how she was a guest on a podcast, and the podcaster published her episode with a photo of her that was not her. It was an AI generated image of her face. So there were some similarities, but it definitely wasn't her, which is bizarre because she's a public figure and you can easily find photos, actual photos of her anywhere. And also, they should have just asked her for a photo of herself to promote the podcast. It just made me think about how, you go on podcasts, you should not have to say, please do not generate an AI version photo of me to promote your show, or please do not generate. I don't know. It sent me on down a weird rabbit hole thinking about that. So yes, anything that is coming out of the chatbots, out of the LLMs, out of the generative AI has to be reviewed by a human, by me, approved by me, and usually rewritten by me or by my colleagues. The concerns I have with AI, I mean, you guys know all of this. On I'm going to give you the list. Addiction, people becoming overly engaged with them. There was a fascinating podcast episode from Ghost of a Podcast with Jessica Laniato about someone who was having a relationship with a chatbot on DeepSeek because of how well the chatbot understood them and how much better it was making them feel than most of their personal or romantic relationships. And I really like the way Jessica approached consulting with this person and helping them sort of like get out of their own head to look at the situation a little bit more objectively. That was a really specific example. Outsourcing thought, like we said, or like I said earlier with that article about your intuitive thinking, your rational, logical thinking, and then outsourcing your thinking to the chatbots and sometimes overriding your own intuition or your own knowledge or wisdom. Bad. Creativity. Andrea Jones said on her podcast episode, Mindful Marketing, that if you think that generative AI is creative, that the output that the generative AI is creating is creative, then you're probably not creative. Hot take. Also, related to creativity, IP, I am very concerned about things that we as humans create getting scraped and adapted and used by the LLMs for corporate profit. I am concerned about liability and legal stuff about if I use a piece of software for a client and that company gets sold to someone else that uses that data for nefarious reasons, where is my liability in that? If I publish something that's inaccurate, where is my liability in that? Environmental and ethical concerns. I am worried about the environmental concerns. I'm worried about water consumption. I'm worried about where these data centers are being built and how it's affecting the local communities and the social justice of it all. On that note, I feel like there's not a lot that I can do. And I feel that individual users often get the amount of shame and blame, the predominant burden of shame and blame for these types of things when we are the minimal users. So there was an episode, this is going to seem like a weird reference, but there's a podcast called Life After MLM, and they recently released an episode breaking down some definitions of AI. So let's just say here, AI is not a monolith. It is not one thing, one product, one company, one service, one process. It refers to a whole bucket of different types of things. But they were breaking down some definitions and some clarifications about what is the difference between assistive or generative or um, general intelligence, artificial general intelligence versus a large language model versus whatever, a calendaring tool, for example. And in that episode, let's see, let me quote the correct episode. It is AI, the good, the bad, and the ugly, part one. And they were talking about how running a chat GPT query uses up a certain amount of water, but it's nothing. It's a drop in the bucket, haha, compared to the actual training of the model itself, which is happening at a corporate level. And the corporate responsibility is just to the shareholders. It's just dollars, right? It has no moral obligation to the planet, unfortunately, in our system. So therefore, the only way to deal with that is through policy and regulation, which we have very little of right now. And so that's on a systemic level and not based on whether I am using ChatGPT or not. And I'm not saying that we have no responsibility within that. We absolutely do have agency and responsibility for making those choices for ourselves. But literally everything we do, it feels like has some kind of impact on the planet. Is doing a chat GPT query worse than driving my car to the store or ordering something online or, building a website or using a cell phone, which takes rare minerals from the earth? Like all of these actions of daily modern living have trade-offs. And that doesn't excuse us to just blindly go about making decisions without considering those trade-offs. But I think that there's a lot that needs to be done at a much bigger scale and at a much bigger level than us choosing whether or not we're going to use an LLM for certain things. That's my current thinking, and it may change. These things do concern me, and I don't know exactly what to do with them. There's also a question, and I think this is the last thing that I am going to leave you with. There is a question about, speaking of agency, whether these AI tools and models are tools and models, or are they something different? Somebody said to me, this has been the way technology has been. There was a time. So one of the things I do in my work is I work with high school students to teach them how to podcast in an online after school program. And there was a time, like maybe 10 years ago, when we were talking about doing online research for your episodes on certain topics and how to identify trustworthy, credible sources like CNN.com versus not credible sources like some wackadoodle website that you've never heard of, that you're not even sure who's writing on it or where it came from. And it's probably all bots. right? And I used to be able to give them guidelines of how to tell a credible source or not a credible source. I don't feel that those guidelines 10 years later hold. And it's harder and harder to do the critical thinking of knowing whether a source online is trustable or not. If you want to go even back longer than 10 years ago, when the internet was new, I was in college. Yes, I was. I was in college. And when we were writing research papers for our classes in college, we were not allowed to cite any online source. There was no World Wide Web internet source that was deemed credible enough at that time to cite as a source in a research paper. If we found something online that we wanted to use, we then needed to find a physically published reference that could back that up. A book, a journal article, something. There had to be another source, a physical source that could back that up. So things have changed, tools have changed. Calculators, the internet, cell phones, all of these tools come with pros and cons. They come with trade-offs. They come with benefits to our lives and they come with negatives. And we have agency as to how often, how much we use them and in what ways, how much trust and faith we put in them, and where our boundaries and our lines in the sand are, and how we disconnect at times, how we touch grass at times, how we stay rooted in our own humanity at times. And that is our individual responsibility to do, even if it is increasingly more and more challenging to disconnect and figure out ways to unplug and do those things. But my question is this a tool like any other, or is it different than a cell phone or the internet or a word processing program as opposed to a manual typewriter, or a typewriter as opposed to an ink pen, or an ink pen as opposed to a quill in a pot of ink? I mean, like, where the technology evolves, we as humans, one of our best qualities is that we adapt. Is this the same, or is it fundamentally something different that we should be more concerned about and therefore treat differently? I don't have an answer. That's my question. I know that if you are a podcaster or you're thinking about podcasting, I am going to be offering some things that may be useful for you. Currently available right now as we speak is my secret podcast, Peace, Love, and Podcasting. This is for people who want to think about the way that they're doing podcasting, the way that they're leveraging the medium in their businesses, in their brands, in their organizations, who want to be scrappy about it. I realize that there is a typo in this. I have to fix this. Hold on. This, the Peace, Love, and Podcasting secret podcast is totally free. You just have to sign up to receive it and then follow the instructions to add it to your favorite podcast player. That is at bit.ly/pep exclusive. That's bit.ly/pep, PEP exclusive. And that is where you can get that free podcast. The audio from this discussion is going to live there. And it's kind of like voice memos from me thinking about these different topics and how they may apply. Actually, I don't know if it's going to be the audio from this specific recording. I might talk more about podcast specific things. Let's see. Something will be there. There are other things there already waiting for you about interview skills, solo episode skills, things like that. Also, if you sign up for the free podcast, you are going to be the first ones to know when enrollment is open for my summer pod camp, which is going to be starting in August of 2026. And this is going to be a 6-week program online. You can participate from anywhere. Even if you're going to be on vacation for part of that time, you can still get everything that you need out of this program. And part of this, not the whole thing, but part of this is going to be thinking through your own AI policies in terms of the content that you're creating and how to, if you're not using AI tools specifically right now, how you might consider leveraging them to help you with your independent podcast, or how you might draw some boundaries if you feel that you're over leveraging. So, we're going to talk about differentiating, standing out in a sea of podcasts, falling in love with your podcast if you feel that it's gotten stale or overwhelming. All of those things will be addressed in our summer camp. And this is the place where you can find out about it first. And there's also going to be a special promotional offer for you that is offered through the Peace, Love, and Podcasting podcast. Again, that's at bit.ly/PEP exclusive. And I'm really looking forward to connecting with some incredible podcasters, building some community, thinking through some specific challenges this summer. And I would love to hear from you if you have listened to this. I cannot believe I just talked for 45 minutes about AI. Blah. I'd love to hear how you're thinking through these things, what you're considering, what I haven't thought of or considered that I should as I'm creating my policy, and more to come, I guess. So, thank you so much for tuning in to this live stream. We will be streaming some upcoming episodes with incredible creators in the When Your Art Becomes Your Job. And I didn't even get into the whole art of this and what this means for a creator. I have to think about that a little bit more. Um, is my writing suffering because of reading too much ChatGPT output? That's a whole other thing. Anyways, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Andrea Klunder. This has been the Creative Imposter Live, and I look forward to having another conversation with you in a couple weeks.